My parents stole my college savings to buy my sister a new MacBook. It was the summer of 2001 in Willow Grove, Pennsylvania, one of those places that time seemed to forget. Our neighborhood was stuck in the 80s, with houses that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since Reagan was in office. Every evening, the smell of freshly cut grass would mix with charcoal from backyard grills, while neighbors chatted on their porches about nothing and everything. I'm Ethan Clark. Back then, I was just 18, skinny as a rail, with perpetually messy hair and enough teenage angst to power a small city. My wardrobe consisted exclusively of faded jeans and band shirts, mostly Nirvana, though I'd rotate in some Pearl Jam when I was feeling fancy. Not exactly geeky material, but it worked for slinging burgers and shakes at Joe's Diner, the local hangout straight out of Back to the Future. The pay was garbage, minimum wage plus whatever tips I could scrape together from the regulars who knew me by name. But Joe's had a certain magic about it. Checkered floors, red vinyl booths worn smooth from decades of sliding teenagers, and a jukebox that still played actual 45s. The place smelled permanently of fryer oil and vanilla milkshakes, and the radio always seemed stuck on the classic rock station. My real passion wasn't serving up double cheeseburgers to football players and their cheerleader girlfriends. It was music, specifically vinyl records. While other kids my age were burning CDs or figuring out that new Napster thing, I was haunting yard sales and thrift shops for forgotten albums. My collection wasn't huge, but it was growing. The Doors, Fleetwood Mac, Pink Floyd, some soul records from Aretha Franklin, and anything else I could afford on my meager budget. There was something about dropping that needle on a record that digital could never capture. The slight crackle before the music starts, the warmth of the sound, the ritual of handling something so delicate yet so durable. Each scratch and pop told a story of the hands that had loved that music before me. I dreamed of studying music journalism in college, writing for Rolling Stone someday, interviewing artists who shaped American culture. But dreams cost money, and money wasn't something we had in abundance. Every dollar I earned went one of three places. Gas in my ancient 1985 Ford pickup, which wheezed and complained like an old man climbing stairs. Bills my parents insisted I contribute to, or my secret college fund, $2, $500 stashed in an empty record sleeve for Boston that I kept under my bed. The truck had been my grandfather's, handed down when he couldn't drive anymore. It was rusty in places. The radio only worked if you hit it just right, and it drank gas like a frat boy at his first kegger. But it was freedom on four wheels, and I loved that heap of metal more than made sense. Home was complicated. My parents, Richard and Linda Clark, weren't bad people. They worked hard. Dad as an insurance adjuster, Mom as a receptionist at the local dentist's office. They just had a glaring blind spot approximately the size and shape of my older sister, Emily. At 19, Emily was everything I wasn't. Confident, outgoing, conventionally attractive, and according to my parents, going places. She was studying fashion design, dreaming of runways in New York, and somehow managing to convince our parents that her every whim deserved financial backing. I got the leftovers, of attention, of resources, of everything. Emily got new clothes for school. I got whatever was on clearance. Emily got a computer for her career. I got told to use a family desktop. Emily's art supplies were investments in her future. My vinyl collection was junk taking up space. Their favorite refrain was some variation of, "Ethan, when are you going to grow up and get serious?" As if dreams had an expiration date, and mine had already passed. The irony of being told to grow up while simultaneously being treated like a child wasn't lost on me. Emily didn't make it easier. Whenever I'd play a record in the living room, she'd walk by with an eye roll and some comment about dinosaurs and their fossils. She'd ask why I couldn't just listen to NSYNC or Britney Spears like a normal person. I'd remind her that Kurt Cobain had more talent in his left pinky than those pop puppets combined, and she'd remind me that Kurt was dead while Justin Timberlake's career was very much alive. Sister stuff, I guess. There was one person who got me, though, my grandmother Ruth. At 78, she was sharp as a tack and cooler than most people half her age. Her house sat on the edge of town, a small, weathered Cape Cod surrounded by overgrown gardens that she refused to tame. Nature doesn't like crew cuts. she'd say whenever someone suggested she hire a landscaper. That house was my sanctuary. It smelled of coffee and oil paints and old books. Vintage lamps cast golden light over furniture that hadn't been in style since the Kennedy administration. The walls were covered with her paintings, abstract splashes of color from her experimental phase in the 60s, landscapes from family trips, portraits of people I'd never meet but somehow felt I knew. Every Wednesday after my shift at Joe's, I'd drive over and we'd share lemonade on her screen porch. Sometimes we'd just sit in comfortable silence. Other times, we'd play records on her ancient turntable, a 1960s Magnavox console that still sounded incredible. The Eagles were her favorite, though she had an impressive collection ranging from Elvis to Johnny Cash to Pink Floyd. We'd debate the finer points of rock history, whether the guitar solo in Hotel California was better than the one in Life in the Fast Lane, if the Beatles' later work outshone their early hits, whether Bob Dylan deserved the Nobel Prize 20 years before he'd eventually get it. She never talked down to me or treated my opinions as less valid because of my age. When life got particularly rough at home, I'd crash on her couch. She never asked questions, just made up the pull-out bed with fresh sheets and left a chocolate chip cookie on the pillow. In the morning, there'd be pancakes and more of her wisdom, delivered without ceremony or expectation. People who can't see the beauty in music can't see the beauty in life, she told me once. They're the ones missing out, not you. Another time, quoting her beloved Bob Dylan. Don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. Simple truths that somehow made my teenage problems seem manageable. Her favorite lesson, though, was about kindness. Being kind when the world is cruel isn't weakness, Ethan. It's the hardest strength there is. I'd think about that whenever Dad would make some cutting remark about my phase, or Mom would sigh dramatically about my future prospects. Ruth had lived through the Great Depression, lost her husband to heart disease in the 80s, and raised 2 kids largely on her own while working as an art teacher. She knew something about resilience and finding joy in small pleasures. Life's too short for bad coffee and boring music, she'd say, pouring us both another cup of strong brew she insisted on grinding fresh each morning. She loved my truck, too, always patting it so affectionately when I'd pull up. This old boy's got more stories in him than most people, she'd say with a wink. Once, after it wouldn't start and I was cursing its existence, she laughed and told me, "Ethan, that pickup is older than my first love affair. Have some respect for your elders." It was a Wednesday evening in late July when everything started to change. I just finished a double shift at Joe's, smelling like fryer grease and feeling bone-tired. All I wanted was a shower and maybe to fall asleep listening to Dark Side of the Moon. Instead, I walked into a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. Our house had this weird acoustic property where voices from the kitchen traveled perfectly to the front hallway. As I closed the front door, I heard my father's voice, unusually animated. He was talking to Emily about some exclusive design workshop she wanted to attend, $1, $200 for a weekend in Philadelphia with some hot shot from New York. "Don't worry about the money," Dad was saying. "Ethan's bringing in paychecks now. He can cover your workshop fees." My stomach dropped like I just hit the first hill on a roller coaster. I stood frozen, keys still in hand, as Emily asked about her spending money for the weekend. Mom's voice now. "We'll figure out. Maybe some of Ethan's contribution to the household expenses can be redirected. It's not like he's got any big expenses. That old truck barely runs anyway." I felt sick. They were planning to use MY money. Money I earned standing for 8-hour shifts, dealing with entitled customers, coming home with aching feet and burns on my arms from the grill, to fund Emily's weekend playing designer with the cool kids. Money that was supposed to be going toward my education fund. My future. But the worst part? They hadn't even considered asking me. It was just assumed that my earnings were family property, while Emily's future was a family priority. I was just a workhorse, the reliable second child who would always be there to pick up the slack. I should have confronted them right then. Should have walked into that kitchen and demanded some respect, some acknowledgement that my dreams mattered too. Instead, I quietly climbed the stairs to my room, avoiding the creaky step-out of habit, and closed the door silently behind me. My room was small, barely enough space for a twin bed, a desk, and the milk crates I used to store my vinyl collection. Posters of Cobain, Hendrix, and Morrison looked down from the walls, eyes seeming to judge my cowardice. I carefully took out my prized first pressing of Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, handling it like the sacred object it was, and placed it on my second-hand turntable. As Stevie Nicks' haunting voice filled the room with dreams, I opened my closet and pulled out the hollowed-out Boston album sleeve where I kept my savings. $2,500. Tips and wages saved over nearly 2 years of working at Joe's. 2,500 steps toward freedom and a future where I could be more than just Ethan the disappointment. I counted it twice, making sure it was all there, then returned it to its hiding place. I needed another $500 before application deadlines in the fall. $500 more, and I could at least apply to state schools with decent journalism programs. It wasn't Rolling Stone, but it was a start. Later that night, I drove to Ruth's house. I didn't call ahead. I never needed to. She answered the door in paint-splattered overalls, gray hair escaping from a loose bun, reading glasses perched on her nose. "The prodigal grandson returns," she said with a smile, stepping aside to let me in. The house smelled like turpentine and chocolate chip cookies, an odd combination that somehow worked, just like Ruth herself. I told her everything. About the conversation I'd overheard, about feeling invisible in my own family, about the growing certainty that if I didn't get out soon, I never would. She listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When I finished, she took off her glasses and fixed me with those clear blue eyes that seemed to see right through all my teenage posturing. You know, Ethan, families are like bands. Sometimes everyone's playing the same song, and sometimes someone's off in their own world, doing a solo that doesn't fit. Right now, your parents and sister are playing one tune, and you're hearing a completely different melody. She got up and went to her record collection, fingers skimming over album covers until she found what she wanted, an old Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young record. As the opening notes of "Teach Your Children" filled the room, she smiled. The thing about music, about life, is that dissonance isn't always bad. Sometimes it's the clash of notes that makes things interesting. But you have to decide if you're going to keep playing along with their song or start writing your own. I stayed late that night, talking about music and dreams and the terrifying prospect of standing up for myself. When I finally left, Ruth hugged me tighter than usual. "Remember, kiddo, the best songs often start with someone being brave enough to play a different note." Driving home under a canopy of stars, windows down and the warm summer air rushing past, I felt something shifting inside me. The steady beat of Fleetwood Mac's Dreams still echoed in my head. Stevie's voice singing about thunder only happening when it's raining, about players only loving you when they're playing. I didn't know it then, but that quiet summer evening, the overheard conversation, the count of my savings, Ruth's wisdom, was the first domino in a chain that would completely reshape my life. By the time I pulled into our driveway, something had changed. I wasn't ready to confront my parents yet, but for the first time, I could feel the shape of my anger, my disappointment, my determination. The house was dark when I got home, everyone already asleep. I crept up to my room and put on my headphones, letting the music wash over me as I stared at the ceiling. That night, I fell asleep with Fleetwood Mac still playing, unaware that the next day would shatter my plans like a hammer through glass. Sometimes life changes in dramatic explosions. Other times, it's the quiet moments, a conversation not meant for your ears, a grandmother's wisdom, the truth in a song written decades before you were born, that marked the real turning points. That night was my quiet before the storm, the deep breath before the plunge. Looking back now, I can see it clearly, the moment when the needle dropped on a different track of my life. The next morning hit like a bad hangover. Even though I hadn't touched a drop, I woke up early with that feeling you get when something's wrong, but your brain hasn't quite remembered what it is yet. Then it all came flooding back. The conversation I'd overheard, my parents planning to use my money for Emily's workshop, the realization that I was nothing more than the family ATM. I lay there for a few minutes, watching dust motes dance in the sunbeam coming through my blinds, thinking about what Ruth had said about playing a different note. Maybe it was time to stand my ground. But first, I needed to make sure my savings were secure. I rolled out of bed and pulled out the Boston album sleeve from its hiding place. It felt lighter somehow, and my stomach tightened with a premonition I didn't want to acknowledge. When I opened it, the sleeve was empty. All $2,500. 2 years of slinging burgers, mopping floors, and dealing with entitled customers gone. For a solid minute, I just stared at the empty sleeve like an idiot, as if the money might magically reappear. Then I tore through my room, checking other album covers, under mattress, in my dresser drawers. Nothing. My college fund had vanished overnight. I glanced at my alarm clock. 5:30 a.m. Everyone else was still asleep, and I had to be at Joe's by 6 o'clock for the morning prep shift. Joe had specifically asked me to come in early to help with delivery and set up for a local business breakfast meeting. Being late wasn't an option. If I wanted to keep the job, I now needed more than ever. I wanted to kick in my parents' door right then and there, demand answers, scream until the neighbors called the cops. But I couldn't afford to lose my job on top of everything else. The confrontation would have to wait. I somehow made it through my morning shift at Joe's, running on autopilot, messing up orders, earning confused looks from the other staff. The whole time, anger simmered just below the surface as I flipped pancakes and refilled coffee for the morning rush. By the time I clocked out at 3, my shock had hardened into something else, a cold, steady anger that felt foreign to my usually conflict-avoidant body. The drive home took 10 minutes. I rehearsed what I'd say at least 20 different ways. Should I be calm and logical? Hurt and emotional? Righteously furious? None of it felt right, but I knew I couldn't let this slide. Those were MY dollars, earned with MY sweat. When I walked in, they were all there, like some twisted family sitcom where everyone's gathered in the living room for the big confrontation scene. Dad reading the newspaper in his recliner, Mom folding laundry on the couch, and Emily sitting cross-legged on the floor, cooing over a brand new MacBook Pro that still had the plastic film on the screen. The laptop probably cost around $2,000. The design workshop was another $1,200. The math wasn't hard. Mom saw me first. Something in my expression must have tipped her off because she immediately got that guilty look. The one parents get when they know they've crossed a line, but are hoping you won't notice or won't say anything. I didn't yell. Somehow, that made it worse. I just stood in the doorway, car keys still in hand, and asked where my money was. The question hung in the air like smoke. Dad lowered his newspaper slowly, doing that thing where he tries to look authoritative and reasonable at the same time. Mom suddenly became very interested in matching socks. Emily kept unpacking her new laptop, pretending she couldn't hear the tension crackling in the air. Dad cleared his throat and launched into what was clearly a prepared speech about family sacrifices and how Emily needed proper tools for her education, how the MacBook was an investment in her future as a designer, how the workshop would give her connections in the industry. Mom chimed in about how they'd pay me back eventually, how this was just a loan, how family helps family. But there was no timeline, no plan, just vague promises that we all knew would evaporate like morning dew. I stood there, hearing but not really listening, watching Emily caress her new laptop with more affection than she'd shown any living thing. 2 years of my life had been converted into brushed aluminum and a glowing Apple logo. 2 years of standing until my feet ached, of coming home smelling like fry grease, of saving every $5 and $10 tip. When Dad finished his speech, he looked at me expectantly, waiting for my understanding, my forgiveness, my capitulation. When I didn't immediately respond, he added the kicker. What were you saving for anyway, Ethan? Community college? With your grades. He looked at my T-shirt, Iron Maiden this time, and sighed. It's not like you're planning to be a doctor. That's when Emily glanced up, a small smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. Maybe you could sell your vinyl collection, Rockstar. Isn't that junk worth something to other weirdos? She turned the MacBook over in her hands reverently. At least my art will lead somewhere. I felt something inside me snap. Not dramatically, not violently, just a quiet breaking of whatever had kept me tethered to this family, to this house, to this version of myself that accepted being less than. That was my college money, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. 2 years of savings. My savings. Dad's face hardened. While you live under my roof, you're part of this family. And in this family, we support each other. Emily needs this more than you need some pipe dream about writing about music. Be realistic, son. I wasn't their son in that moment. I was just a kid who lived in the spare room, the one whose dreams weren't worth the same consideration as Emily's. The afterthought, the extra, the spare, those were my earnings. I said, you stole from me. Mom gasped like I'd slapped her. Dad's face went from red to purple, the vein in his forehead pulsing like a visual metronome. How dare you, after all we've done for you? Putting a roof over your head, feeding you, clothing you. The bare minimum, I interrupted, surprising even myself. You've done the bare minimum a parent is supposed to do, and now you've taken what was mine without asking. That's stealing, no matter how you dress it up. Emily rolled her eyes dramatically. God, Ethan, stop being such a drama queen. It's just money. It wasn't just money. It was my future. It was my independence. It was a tangible proof that my dreams mattered too. Dad stood up then, using his height advantage to loom over me like he did when I was 10, and had broken a window with a baseball. Listen here, young man. While you live under MY roof, you follow MY rules. If you don't like it, you know where the door is. There it was, the ultimatum, the line in the sand. I looked around the living room, at the family photos where Emily was always center frame, and I was awkwardly off to the side, at the trophy case filled with Emily's dance awards and fashion competition ribbons, at the walls that had never featured any of my interests or accomplishments. This had never really been my home. It had been a place I slept, a place I existed, but not a place where I belonged. Fine, I said quietly. I'll be gone in an hour. Mom started crying then, those manipulative tears that appear whenever she doesn't get her way. Dad looked momentarily startled, like a poker player whose bluff had been called. Emily just kept setting up her new laptop, the corners of her mouth twitching upward slightly. I went upstairs and pulled out my duffel bag, the one I used for overnight trips to roofs. I packed methodically. Clothes, toiletries, my vinyl collection, carefully wrapped in T-shirts for protection, my portable turntable, and the few books I couldn't bear to leave behind. It all fit into the duffel and 2 milk crates. 18 years of existence condensed into what would fit in my truck. As I carried the last load down the stairs, Mom tried to block my way at the door. Her eyes were red, but dry now. Ethan, don't be dramatic. Let's talk about this like adults. The irony wasn't lost on me, being told to act like an adult by the same people who had just treated me like a child. There's nothing to talk about, I said, stepping around her. You've made your choice. I'm making mine. Dad watched in the living room, arms crossed, face set in that stubborn expression he got when he was too proud to back down even though he knew he was wrong. You'll be back, he said as I opened the front door. The real world is a lot harder than you think, son. That wasn't a father's concern. It was a prediction meant to make himself feel better, to recast his actions as tough love rather than the betrayal they were. I loaded everything into my truck, the suspension groaning slightly under the weight of my vinyl collection. The mid-July heat was oppressive, the vinyl seats of the pickup hot enough to brand skin. As I turned the key, the engine sputtered, coughed, and finally caught, as if even my truck was hesitant about the sudden change of plans. In my rear-view mirror, I could see Mom standing in the doorway, one hand raised in either farewell or a plea to return. Dad wasn't visible. Emily had never even come outside. I drove straight to Ruth's house. I hadn't called ahead, didn't even know if she was home, but I had nowhere else to go. My hand shook slightly on the steering wheel, adrenaline and uncertainty making me jittery. The old Bob Seger song, Against the Wind, played on the classic rock station, and I turned it up until the truck's ancient speakers distorted with the volume. Ruth's blue Cape Cod came into view, its weathered shingles and white trim familiar and comforting. Her garden was a riot of midsummer color. Black-eyed Susans, purple coneflowers, daylilies in blazing orange and yellow. No regimented rows or formal patterns, just wildness barely contained, just like Ruth herself. She must have heard the distinctive rattle of my truck, because she was already standing on the porch when I pulled up, wiping paint-stained hands on her apron. One look at me, at the stuffed duffel and milk crates visible in the truck bed, and she knew. No questions, no lectures, no "I told you so." Just open arms and "You're home now, kiddo." Those 4 words broke something in me that I hadn't realized was still holding together. I stood in her embrace, forehead pressed against her shoulder. I'd outgrown her by the time I was 14, and felt the anger drain away, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and something like relief. Later, after I brought in my meager possessions and Ruth had made us both mugs of tea strong enough to stand a spoon in, I told her everything. The empty album sleeve, the new MacBook, the confrontation and ultimatum. Ruth listened without interrupting, those bright blue eyes taking it all in. When I finished, she sighed deeply and reached across the kitchen table to pat my hand. "Your father," she said with a shake of her head, "has always been able to justify anything to himself. Even as a boy, he could convince himself that whatever he wanted was right and fair. Your mother, well, she's always taken the path of least resistance." She got up and went to an old cookie jar shaped like a fat rooster, retrieving a key from inside it. "The back bedroom is yours for as long as you need it. No rent, no conditions. Just help with groceries when you can and promise me you won't give up on your dreams just because some people couldn't see their value." I promised. It felt like a vow, like something sacred in the quiet of Ruth's yellow kitchen with its faded linoleum and mismatched chairs. "Life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans," she said with a small smile. I recognized it as John Lennon's words. Your plans got derailed today, but that doesn't mean you've lost your way. Sometimes the scenic route teaches you more than the highway. That night, I slept in Ruth's spare room, a small space with floral wallpaper that had probably been there since the 70s, a twin bed with a handmade quilt, and a dresser that smelled faintly of cedar. I put my turntable on a nightstand and played Simon and Garfunkel's Bookends on low volume, letting the gentle harmonies of America wash over me as I stared at the unfamiliar ceiling. The next few weeks fell into a new rhythm. I kept my job at Joe's, though the commute was longer from Ruth's place. I helped around her house, fixing the squeaky screen door, repainting the peeling bathroom ceiling, mowing the lawn when the wildflowers weren't in bloom. In the evenings, we'd sit on her porch, drinking homemade lemonade or her special sweet tea, listening to records and talking. Ruth told me stories about growing up during the Depression, about falling in love with my grandfather at a USO dance during the war, about raising my father and Ann in the 1950s while working as an art teacher. She showed me photos I'd never seen. My dad as a solemn-eyed child, my grandfather in his army uniform, Ruth herself as a young woman with victory rolls in her hair and fire in her eyes. She also told me about the painting in her living room, an abstract canvas of blue, black, and silver splashes that I'd always assumed was one of hers. Turns out it was a gift from a drifter her father had taken in during the 1940s, a man who stayed for 3 months before disappearing as suddenly as he'd arrived. "It's probably just trash," she laughed, gesturing at the chaotic swirls of color. "But I've always liked it. Reminds me that beauty doesn't have to make sense." I barely glanced at the painting. I was still too angry at my parents, too wrapped up in my own problems, to care about some old canvas from before my grandmother was married. If I'd paid more attention, maybe I would have noticed a faded signature in the corner, but my eyes slid right past it. Besides, I had started writing, filling notebooks with thoughts about music, with album reviews, with dreams of futures that suddenly seemed both more distant and more possible than before. Ruth read everything I wrote, offering gentle critiques and enthusiastic encouragement. "You've got a voice, Ethan," she told me one evening as we sat listening to Pink Floyd's The Wall and watching fireflies rise from her overgrown lawn. "A real perspective. You just need to believe in it enough to let other people hear it." One night, about a month into my stay, Ruth set down her teacup and looked at me seriously across the kitchen table. "I've been thinking, Ethan, I'm going to change my will. This house should go to you when I'm gone. You're the only one who really loves it anyway." I laughed, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Don't talk like that. You're going to outlive us all out of sheer stubbornness. She smiled, but her eyes remained serious. Everyone has their time, kiddo. And when mine comes, I want to know that this place, these walls that have heard so much music and seen so much life, will go to someone who understands what makes them special. I couldn't imagine a world without Ruth in it. So I changed the subject, asking her opinion on whether the Clash or the Ramones had more influence on American punk. She let me steer us back to safer waters, but the next day I saw her making an appointment with her lawyer on the kitchen calendar. I didn't know then that fate had its own plans. Plans that would test everything I thought I knew about family, about value, about what really matters in this brief, beautiful, terrible life we're given. And those plans were coming for me faster than any of us could have anticipated. Life has a cruel sense of timing. Just when you think you've found your footing, the ground shifts beneath you like a California fault line. That's exactly what happened to me about 6 weeks after moving in with Ruth. It was a Tuesday morning in late August, the kind of day where the summer heat starts to soften around the edges, hinting at the fall to come. I had a late shift at Joe's, so I slept in until 9. The house was unusually quiet when I woke up. No sound of Ruth puttering the kitchen, no smell of fresh coffee, no classic rock playing softly from the old radio in the living room. At first, I didn't think much of it. Ruth often worked in her garden early, taking advantage of the cooler morning hours. But when I went downstairs and saw her coffee mug still in the dish rack from the night before, a flicker of unease passed through me. I called her name. Nothing. I checked the backyard, expecting to find her among the daylilies and black-eyed Susan she tended with such care. Empty. Her gardening hat still hung on its hook by the back door. Then I noticed the soft sound of music coming from the sunroom at the front of the house, her favorite spot for morning reading. The familiar strains of Fleetwood Mac's Landslide drifted through the hallway. Stevie Nicks singing about seeing her reflection in the snow-covered hills. Ruth was in her favorite armchair, the one with faded blue upholstery and the small tear on the left armrest that she'd never gotten around to fixing. She looked peaceful, a book open on her lap, half-empty teacup on the side table. For a split second, I thought she was napping, but the stillness was too complete. The absence of the gentle rise and fall of breath too obvious. I fell to my knees beside her chair, saying her name over and over like a broken record. Her skin was cool to the touch. The medical examiner would later tell me it was a massive heart attack, probably quick and painless. Small mercies, I guess. The next hours passed in a blur of paramedics, police officers asking routine questions, neighbors appearing at the door with shocked expressions. I moved through it all like a ghost, answering questions mechanically, signing forms, making calls I never imagined having to make. The worst call was to my parents. Dad answered, and for once, his voice lost its usual edge when I told him his mother was gone. Mom got on the line, crying immediately. They said they'd come right over. I hung up feeling numb, wondering if grief would bridge the gulf between us or just highlight how far apart we drifted. They arrived 2 hours later with Emily in tow. Mom hugged me tightly, her tears soaking my shoulder. Dad looked older somehow, the lines around his eyes deeper, his shoulders curved inward. Even Emily seemed subdued, her usual sharp comments replaced by awkward silence. For a moment, we were just a family dealing with loss. The money, the arguments, the bitterness, all temporarily set aside in the face of something bigger. But grief has a way of pulling back the curtain on relationships, revealing their true foundations. And ours was built on sand. The facade cracked the next day when Dad asked if Ruth had updated her like she'd mentioned. The question wasn't malicious, just practical in that way Dad always was. But it reminded me that she'd never gotten around to making that appointment with her lawyer. The calendar entry had been for the following week. The answer came 3 days later at the reading of the will. Ruth's lawyer, a balding man with kind eyes and a bow tie that seemed out of place in small-town Pennsylvania, explained that the will was nearly 10 years old. Under its terms, her modest savings would be split equally between my father and his sister, who lived in Arizona. And the house that Ruth had promised would be mine, would go to her only son, Richard Clark, my father. I sat in that wood-paneled office, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. Not because of the money. I'd never expected or wanted Ruth's savings. But because the house that had been my refuge was now just another asset to be disposed of. Dad didn't even look at me when he started talking about selling the place. It needs a new roof, he said to the lawyer. And the property taxes have gone up. Plus, Emily's tuition for design school is due next month. Mom added, her voice gentle but firm. Ethan, you understand, right? You're an adult now. These are just the realities we have to face. The realities were that I'd be homeless again. The realities were that the one place where I felt truly accepted would be sold to strangers. The realities were that even in death, Ruth couldn't protect me from a family that saw me as an afterthought. My name wasn't mentioned anywhere in the will. Ruth had intended to update it, to leave me something, but time had run out before she could make it official. Everything went to my father and aunt. As we were leaving the lawyer's office, Dad finally acknowledged my presence. We'll be clearing out the house this weekend. That vinyl collection and all those old paintings, I'm just going to trash them. If you want any of that junk as keepsakes, you can take it. Save me a trip to the dump. I nodded mutely, not trusting myself to speak. The painting, the one the drifter had left with Ruth's father, meant nothing to me, but the records, the turntable, those were pieces of Ruth, of our time together. Somehow, even years ago when she wrote that will, she'd known what would matter most to me. On the drive back to Ruth's, no, my father's house now, Emily finally broke her silence. So, what are you going to do now, Ethan? The question wasn't unkind, just curious, as if she was genuinely wondering how the black sheep of the family would survive this latest setback. What was I going to do? The question echoed in my head as I packed up my belongings and Ruth's bequest. Dad had given me 1 week to find a new place and clear out, generous, he called it, since technically it was his house now, and he could have demanded I leave immediately. Finding affordable housing in Willow Grove with minimum wage and no savings was nearly impossible. I spent 3 days calling every apartment listing in the classifieds, each one either too expensive or already taken. On the 4th day, desperate and running out of time, I found it, a tiny studio apartment above Gino's Pizzeria on Main Street. The place was a dump, 500 square feet of peeling linoleum, water stains on the ceiling, and a shower that ran either ice cold or scalding with no in-between. But the rent was just within my budget if I picked up extra shifts, and Gino, the owner, didn't care about credit checks or security deposits as long as I paid on time. Bonus, he told me with his thick Italian accent, pizza smell is free. I moved in with what fit in my truck. Clothes, Ruth's vinyl collection and turntable, and that abstract painting I still couldn't bring myself to care about. The apartment was so small that the only place of the painting was leaning against the wall behind the second-hand dresser I'd found at Goodwill. Joe's Diner wasn't giving me enough hours to cover even my meager rent. So I picked up a second job tending bar at the Rusty Nail, a dive joint a few blocks from my apartment. The place smelled like stale beer and cigarettes. This was before Pennsylvania banned indoor smoking, and the jukebox played nothing but worn-out covers of Bon Jovi and Lynyrd Skynyrd. But the tips were decent, and the owner didn't care that I was only 18 as long as I didn't drink on the job. Between the 2 jobs, I was working 60-hour weeks. I dragged myself home at 2 a.m. after closing the bar, fall into bed for a few hours, then get up to open Joe's at 6. My hands perpetually smelled like grease, and beer no matter how many times I washed them. My back ached from being on my feet all day. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. But the worst part wasn't the physical exhaustion. It was the crushing loneliness. I'd gone from a house filled with Ruth's warmth and wisdom to an empty apartment, where the only sounds were the rumble of the pizza oven downstairs and the occasional shouts from drunk college kids passing by on weekends. At night, I'd put on one of Ruth's records, usually Fleetwood Mac's Rumors or the Eagles' Hotel California, and stare at the water stains on my ceiling. Sometimes the music would transport me back to her porch, to those conversations that had made me feel seen and valued. But more often than not, the familiar songs just highlighted how much I'd lost. My upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Petrovich, a 60-something widow with dyed red hair and a perpetual cigarette, would bang on her floor at my ceiling. whenever I played records after 9 p.m. "This is 2001, not 1965, she'd shout through the thin walls. "Get headphones or get CD player like a normal person." I'd turn the volume down, but never off. The vinyl was my connection to Ruth, to myself, to whatever dreams I still had left. Plus, as Ruth would have said, Mrs. Petrovich's musical taste was questionable at best. She played the same Celine Dion album every Sunday morning while cleaning her apartment. About a month into this new life, when the initial shock of grief had dulled into a persistent ache, I found myself struggling not just to survive, but to find any meaning in what my life had become. Working, sleeping, existing, but not really living. That's when I started writing. Not for anyone else at first, just for myself. Late at night, between shifts, I'd scribble album reviews and music reflections in a cheap notebook from the dollar store. Writing about music, the textures, emotions, and histories behind the songs, gave me a sense of purpose, a way to process not just the notes but my own tangled emotions. On a whim, I sent one of my reviews, a piece about the Doors' L.A. Woman and its connection to American open road mythology, to the editor of the Willow Grove Gazette. To my shock, he published it in their Saturday entertainment section. No pay, just a byline, but seeing my name in print felt like the first real accomplishment in months. I kept writing, and the Gazette kept publishing my pieces. Reviews of classic albums, reflections on local bands that played at the Rusty Nail, even an interview with a former session musician who retired to Willow Grove after playing with everyone from Springsteen to Dylan in the 70s and 80s. The writing didn't pay the bills, but it kept me sane. It gave me something to think about besides grief and resentment, a way to honor Ruth's belief in me even when my own was wavering. "Beauty in the struggle," she told me once. I clung to those words like a life preserver in the storm-tossed sea my life had become. Sometimes I'd wonder why this was happening to me. Why had Ruth been taken right when I needed her most? Why had my family failed me so completely? Why was I working 2 dead-end jobs when all I wanted was to study music journalism? The questions would circle like vultures, picking at whatever optimism I managed to muster. On particularly bad nights, I'd find myself staring at that abstract painting, the one Ruth had specifically left to me along with her records. It was an odd piece, all chaotic blue and black splashes with silver streaks cutting through them like lightning. In certain lights, from certain angles, the random patterns almost seemed to form into something coherent. A face, a landscape, a moment of clarity in the chaos. But then I'd blink, and it would just be random paint again. Kind of like my life at that point, brief moments of meaning surrounded by incomprehensible chaos. I still couldn't bring myself to care about the painting itself, but I kept it as a reminder of Ruth, of her ability to find beauty in things others dismissed. For months into this existence, I couldn't really call it living. Something happened that would change everything. It was a rainy November night, the kind where the cold seeps into your bones, and even the streetlights seemed dimmer than usual. I was closing up the Rusty Nail, wiping down the bar while the owner counted the register. The last customers had staggered out nearly an hour before, and I was looking forward to collapsing into bed for my precious few hours of sleep before the morning shift at Joe's. That's when I heard the knock on the door, tentative at first, then more insistent. I looked at Mike, the owner, who shrugged and nodded toward the door. "See who it is. If they're drunk, tell them we're closed till tomorrow." I unlocked the heavy door, prepared to turn away some intoxicated college kid looking for one more drink. Instead, I found a girl about my age, soaked to the skin, arms wrapped tightly around herself against the cold. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, mascara running in faint tracks down her cheeks. She wasn't drunk, just desperate. "We're closed," I said automatically, then immediately felt like a jerk as she visibly deflated. "I know, She gestured vaguely at the rain pouring down around her. "Could I just wait inside until this lets up a bit? My ride bailed, and I missed the last bus." I stood there, rain splashing onto my shoes, looking at the shivering stranger. In her eyes, I saw something familiar, a vulnerability mixed with determination that reminded me of myself these past few months. I didn't know it then, but this moment, this simple decision to let someone in from the rain, would fundamentally alter the course of my life. As I stepped aside to let her in out of the downpour, I had no idea that the real storm and the unexpected calm that would follow it was just beginning. Her name was Sophia Martinez, 19 years old with rain-soaked hair and a worn backpack containing everything she owned. Mike had gone to back office. So I offered her coffee, the terrible kind that had been sitting on the burner for hours, and a clean bar towel to dry off. "Thanks," she said, wrapping her hands around the mug for warmth. My roommate was supposed to pick me up after my night class, but she's not answering her phone. As she sipped the coffee, making a slight face at the bitter taste but drinking it anyway, her story tumbled out. Her stepfather had kicked her out a year ago when she insisted on pursuing art instead of the business degree he'd planned for her. Her mother had chosen her husband's side. Sophia had been couch surfing and working odd jobs until she'd saved enough for community college tuition and a tiny room in a shared apartment. Now my roommate's boyfriend moved in without asking, and they keep forgetting to tell me about changes in plans, she explained, hence being stranded in the rain at midnight. I gave her my denim jacket to replace her soaked sweater. As she slipped it on, looking like a kid playing dress-up in her dad's clothes, I realized how similar our stories were. Families that had chosen someone else, dreams that seemed impractical to everyone but us, the struggle to stay afloat when the current kept pushing us under. By the time Mike announced he was heading home and tossed me the keys to lock up, I'd offered Sophia a ride and told her more about myself than I'd told anyone since Ruth died. "You must think I'm pathetic," I said as I pulled my truck up to her apartment building, a dingy 3-story walk-up with peeling paint and a broken security door, spilling my life story to a complete stranger. Sophia turned to me, her face serious in the dashboard light. "The way I see it, we're not strangers anymore. Just two people who recognize something familiar in each other." I watched until she made it inside safely, wondering if I'd ever see her again. I didn't have to wonder long. The next evening, she showed up at the Rusty Nail with a sketchbook under her arm and a determined expression on her face. "I'm drawing the patrons for a class project," she announced, settling onto a bar stool. "If that's okay with you and Mike." It became our routine. She'd arrive around 9, order a Coke, never alcohol, and sketch for hours while I worked. On slow nights, we'd talk between customers about music, art, books, dreams, and disappointments. She showed me her drawings, these incredible portraits that somehow captured not just faces, but the essence of people. About 3 weeks into this arrangement, Sophia's roommate situation imploded. The boyfriend had officially moved in, and they decided Sophia's rent contribution should increase, since there were technically 3 people now. "I can't afford it," she told me, frustration evident in the tense line of her shoulders. "I'm already working 2 jobs plus school. I don't know where I'm going to go." The words left my mouth before I fully processed them. There's an empty studio across the hall from mine, above Gino's. It's small, but the rent's reasonable. 2 days later, Sophia was my neighbor, her few possessions filling the tiny studio that mirrored my own. The first night, we celebrated with pizza from downstairs and an impromptu listening session of my vinyl collection, sprawled on my apartment floor among unpacked boxes. "This is the real stuff," she said, carefully handling my original pressing of the Rolling Stones' Sticky Fingers. "Music you can feel, not just hear." Our friendship deepened over the next few months. We'd share meals, usually her cooking because mine was limited to scrambled eggs and toast, and spend evenings listening to records or watching old movies on my small TV. On Sundays, her one day off from both jobs, we'd explore thrift stores for vinyl treasures or art supplies, depending on whose turn it was to choose. She taught me to see things differently, not just to look, but to observe. "Drawing isn't about reproducing what's in front of you," she explained one evening, guiding my hand as I attempted to sketch a simple coffee mug. "It's about understanding what you're seeing. The light, the shadow, the relationship between objects." My attempts were laughable, stick figures with slightly more detail, but Sophia never mocked them. "You're not hopeless, Ethan," she'd say with a half-smile that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. "Just uniquely talented. Maybe stick to writing about music." I kept trying anyway, if only to keep her sitting close to me, her hand occasionally covering mine to demonstrate a technique. Somewhere between late-night talks about our childhood dreams and early morning coffee shared on a fire escape, watching the sunrise over our small town, I fell in love with Sofia Martinez. Not dramatically or suddenly, but gradually, inevitably, like a favorite song that becomes part of your DNA after hearing it countless times. It happened so naturally that I didn't realize it until one spring evening. Almost 9 months after that rainy night, she'd appeared at the Rusty Nail. We were sitting on the roof of my apartment building, technically off limits, but accessible if you knew which maintenance door was usually unlocked. The night was warm, stars visible despite the town's lights, and Sophia was telling me about her latest project, a series of paintings inspired by music. "I'm trying to capture how songs feel, not how they sound," she explained, her face animated in a way that only happened when she talked about art. Like how Stairway to Heaven starts delicate and builds to something massive, or how Nina Simone's voice in Feeling Good is like watching the sun break through clouds after a storm. Looking at her in that moment, dark hair lifted occasionally by the breeze, eyes bright with passion, hands gesturing as she explained her vision, I was struck by the realization that I couldn't imagine my life without her in it. I didn't say anything that night. The timing didn't feel right, and fear of ruining what we had kept me silent. But something had shifted inside me, a certainty I hadn't felt since before Ruth died. Summer arrived, bringing sweltering heat that made our apartments nearly unbearable. We spent more time in air-conditioned coffee shops or the public library, where Sophia would sketch and I'd write music reviews for the local paper, which had started paying me a small fee for my weekly column. One particularly brutal August day, the air thick with humidity and my apartment feeling like a sauna, Sophia suggested we head to the park where evening concerts were held during summer months. "There's supposed to be a Guns N' Roses cover band tonight," she said, already packing a small cooler with sandwiches and iced tea. "Better than melting in here." The band was surprisingly good, the lead singer capturing Axl Rose's distinctive vocals without becoming a caricature. As they played Sweet Child O' Mine, Sophia leaned against my shoulder, her face tilted up to the darkening sky. Without overthinking it, I slipped my arm around her waist. She turned to look at me, surprised but not pulling away. "I've been wanting to do that for months," I admitted. "I've been waiting for you to catch up," she replied with a smile that made my heart stutter. Our first kiss happened there, under stars and streetlights, with a soundtrack of borrowed rock anthems played by talented impersonators. It wasn't perfect, nothing in real life ever is, but it was ours, authentic in a way that mattered more than perfection. Life took on a dreamlike quality after that. We were still two broke kids working multiple jobs to make ends meet, still living in tiny apartments above a pizza place, still fighting to make our creative dreams reality, but we were doing it together now. The struggle didn't disappear, but became bearable, even beautiful sometimes, when shared. A year after that rainy night when Sophia first knocked on the Rusty Nail's door, I proposed. Not with an expensive ring I couldn't afford, but with a vintage vinyl of Nina Simone's Feeling Good. The song she once told me reminded her of hope breaking through despair. "Yes," she said before I even finished asking, tears making tracks down her cheeks. "Of course, yes." We couldn't afford a place of our own yet, but we decided to combine our lives anyway. Sophia would move into my apartment since it was slightly larger, though larger was relative when talking about spaces barely bigger than walk-in closets. The weekend of the move, we tackled my apartment first, try to make room for her easel, art supplies, and clothing. I was shifting furniture, attempting to create enough space in the bedroom corner for her drafting table, when I pushed my dresser away from the wall. "What's that behind there?" Sophia asked, pointing to something that had been hidden between the dresser and wall. I'd almost forgotten about it. Ruth's painting, the one my father had dismissed as junk, and I'd taken more out of spite than appreciation. I'd propped it there when I first moved in and promptly forgotten about it, too wrapped up in grief and survival to care about some old abstract canvas. "Just an old painting from my grandmother's house," I said, pulling it out and wiping away a year's worth of dust. My dad was going to throw it away when they cleared out her place. Sophia took it from my hands reverently, carrying it to where the afternoon light from my single window would illuminate it better. She studied it silently, eyes moving methodically across the canvas. I watched her face change from curiosity to shock to something like awe. "Ethan," she said finally, her voice unnaturally quiet, "do you have any idea what this is?" I looked at the painting again. Chaotic splashes of blue and black with silver streaks cutting through them. It had always just been that old painting to me, a reminder of Ruth, but not something I'd ever given much thought to. It's just some abstract thing from Ruth's house, probably painted by a local artist or something. Sophia shook her head slowly. "This looks like a Pollock, like Jackson Pollock." I laughed, the sound harsh in the quiet apartment. "Right, and my truck is secretly a Ferrari." "I'm serious," she insisted, pointing to various elements of the composition. The technique, the layering, the controlled chaos. It's a style exactly. And look, in the corner, she pointed some faded marks I'd never noticed. That could be a signature. I reminded her of Ruth's story, how the painting had been left by some drifter her father had taken in during the 1940s. There was no way it was a real Pollock. Those were worth millions. Things like that didn't happen to people like me. But Sophia wouldn't let it go. "Remember my professor, Dr. Linden? He specializes in abstract expressionism. He could tell us for sure." To humor her, and because I couldn't deny her anything when she looked at me with such excitement, I agreed to take the painting to her professor. What was the harm in letting an expert confirm it was worthless? Dr. Linden was a thin, energetic man with wire-rimmed glasses and a bow tie that seemed too whimsical for someone with his scholarly credentials. He examined the painting carefully, using a magnifying glass to study the signature, the canvas, the layering of paint. "Where did you say you got this?" he asked, not looking up from his examination. I explained about Ruth, about the drifter in the 1940s, about finding it behind my dresser after nearly forgetting its existence. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting." He asked if he could keep it for a week to run some tests, analyzing the paint composition, the canvas age, comparing the technique to known works. Again, to humor Sophia, I agreed. What did I have to lose? That week was the longest of my life. Sophia alternated between cautious excitement and attempts to temper my expectations. "Even if it's not a Pollock, it's still a beautiful piece," she'd say, "and it connects you to Ruth. That's what matters." But a small flame of hope had been lit, and I couldn't extinguish it completely. What if by some miracle it was real? What would that mean for us, for our future together? 7 days later, Dr. Linden called and asked us to come to his office. His expression was unreadable as we sat across from him, the painting carefully positioned on an easel beside his desk. "I've consulted with colleagues at several major museums," he began, his voice measured. "We've analyzed the materials, the technique, the provenance based on your grandmother's story." He paused, adjusting his bow tie, and I felt Sophia's hand tighten around mine. "While I can't be absolutely certain without further testing by specialized labs, all evidence suggests this is indeed an early Jackson Pollock, likely from around 1943 to 1944, before his drip period became fully developed." The world seemed to tilt sideways. I heard Sophia gasp beside me, felt her squeeze my hand so hard it hurt, but I couldn't process what Dr. Linden was saying. "That's impossible," I managed finally. "Actually, it's quite plausible," the professor continued, warming to his subject. "Pollock was relatively unknown in the early 1940s, drinking heavily, struggling financially. He traveled extensively during those years, picking up odd jobs. The story of your great-grandfather taking in a drifter who left this painting as thanks? It aligns perfectly with Pollock's life during that period." He went on to explain that if authenticated by the major auction houses, a previously unknown early Pollock could be worth millions, potentially $5 to $10 million, though he cautioned that the art market was unpredictable. Sophia and I left his office in a daze, the painting carefully wrapped and tucked under my arm like it was made of glass. We didn't speak until we were back in my truck, sitting in the college parking lot, the engine off. Holy! I couldn't even finish the thought. Is this really happening? Sophia looked as stunned as I felt. "I think it is. What are you going to do?" What was I going to do? The question echoed in my head as we drove home in silence. The painting, possibly worth more than I could earn in several lifetimes, resting on the seat between us. We spent that night talking through possibilities until dawn crept through the window. By morning, we had a plan. We'd pursue authentication through a major auction house. If the painting proved genuine, we'd sell it. The idea of keeping something so valuable in our tiny apartment above a pizza place was laughable, and the money could change our lives in ways we'd never imagined possible. The next weeks were a blur of experts, paperwork, and anxiety. We carefully wrapped the painting and drove it to Christie's New York office, where a team of specialists awaited us. The process was intimidating. Security checks, climate control rooms, experts in white gloves examining every inch of the canvas. They took photographs, samples, recorded Ruth's story as I remembered it. They compared the brushwork to known Pollocks, analyzed the paint composition, researched Jackson Pollock's whereabouts during the early 1940s. Finally, after what felt like years but was actually just over a month, we received a call. The painting was authentic. They wanted to feature it in their upcoming Modern Masters auction in New York. Sophia and I joked about being treasure hunters, but beneath the humor, fear lingered. What if this was all an elaborate mistake? What if the auction came and no one bid? What if the money changed us in ways we couldn't predict? I thought often of Ruth during those weeks of waiting, of her words about beauty hiding in unexpected places, of how she'd lived surrounded by a masterpiece without ever knowing its value, appreciating it simply because it spoke to her. I wonder if she'd known, somewhere deep down, that the painting was special beyond its appearance. Had she left it to me intentionally, knowing I'd need it most? The night before we left for New York, I dreamed of Ruth. She was sitting in her blue armchair, the Pollock hanging behind her. "The value was always there, Ethan," she said in that matter-of-fact way of hers. "You just needed the right eyes to see it." I woke with tears on my face and Sophia's arms around me. "She'd be happy for you," she whispered into the darkness. "For us." The auction house put us up in a hotel nicer than any place I'd ever stayed. The morning of the auction, we dressed in the best clothes we owned. Sophia in a simple black dress she'd found at a thrift store, me in slacks and a button-down shirt that felt foreign against my skin after years of T-shirts and jeans. We sat in the front row of the auction room, surrounded by wealthy collectors and art dealers who looked like they belonged there in a way we never would. When they brought out Ruth's painting, now listed as Untitled Blue Convergence, circa 1943 to 1944 by Jackson Pollock, my heart nearly stopped. The bidding started at $1 million and quickly escalated. $2 million, $3 million, $4 million. Each increment represented more money than I'd ever expected to see in my lifetime. Sophia gripped my hand so tightly I lost feeling in my fingers. $5 million, $6 million, $7 million. When the gavel finally fell at $8.5 million, I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't process that the junk my father had nearly thrown away, the canvas that had gathered dust behind my dresser for a year, had just sold for something that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of our lives. As we stood in the auction house afterward, holding the official letter confirming the sale, I turned to Sophia. "This isn't the end," I realized aloud. "It's just the beginning." Her eyes met mine, reflecting the mix of terror and exhilaration I felt. Are we ready for what comes next? I didn't know the answer. How could anyone be ready for such a seismic shift in their circumstances? All I knew was that we'd face it together, and that somehow, impossibly, Ruth was still taking care of me, even after she was gone. The painting that no one had valued, the beauty that had hidden in plain sight for decades, had become our future. And as dizzying as that was, I couldn't help feeling that somewhere Ruth was smiling her knowing smile, whispering that familiar truth. The most valuable things in life are often right in front of you, if only you have the wisdom to recognize them. Life has a way of coming full circle when you least expect it. One moment you're scrubbing beer mugs in a dive bar, wondering how you'll make rent. The next, you're signing papers for a windfall that changes everything. After taxes and auction house fees, Sophia and I walked away with just over $6 million. The number was so enormous it didn't feel real, like Monopoly money or a figure in a dream. We'd sit up late at night, spreadsheets open on Sophia's laptop, trying to wrap our heads around what it all meant. How do you even begin a plan when suddenly anything seems possible? We decided to take it slow. No mansions, no sports cars, no crazy splurges that would make us the next cautionary tale about lottery winners who lose everything. The first thing we did was pay off our student loans, Sophia's art school debt, and the community college classes I've been taking part-time. Then we bought a modest but beautiful craftsman-style house on the edge of town. It was nothing extravagant by millionaire standards. For bedrooms, a studio space for Sophia, a wraparound porch where I could sit and listen to records as the sun went down. But to us, it was a palace. The first night, we slept on a mattress on the floor because we hadn't bought furniture yet, giggling like kids at a sleepover about the echo in the empty rooms. Sophia went back to art school full-time, enrolling in a prestigious program she'd always dreamed of but could never afford. I invested in myself, too, finishing my journalism degree and setting aside startup capital for a business idea that had been forming in my mind since Ruth first introduced me to vinyl. Neither of us quit working entirely. Sophia still painted commission pieces, and I kept writing my music column, now for a larger regional paper. There was something about continuing to earn our own money, even with millions in the bank. That felt important, a tether to reality in circumstances that still seemed surreal. We remembered where we came from. Instead of designer clothes or fancy cars, we created college scholarships for kids from our old neighborhood, focusing on students pursuing arts and music. We donated to community college that had given us both a chance when four-year universities were out of reach. We set up a fund for emergency housing assistance for young adults who'd been kicked out by family, kids in the same boat Sophia and I had been in. But my passion project, the one that consumed most of my waking thoughts, was a place I'd started calling Vinyl and Coffee in my mind, a retro cafe that would combine my love of classic music with the community feeling I remember from Joe's Diner all those years ago. Finding the right location took months. I wanted something with character, with history, not some sterile strip mall space. When the old hardware store on Main Street went up for sale, with its high ceilings, exposed brick walls, and huge windows, I knew it was perfect. The building dated back to the 1920s and had been everything from a general store to a dance hall before becoming a hardware shop in the 60s. The renovation took nearly a year. I was there every day, working alongside the contractors, making sure every detail was exactly as I'd envisioned. Sophia designed the interior, a blend of vintage and modern that somehow worked perfectly together, just like us, rich with tones, comfortable boots upholstered in deep blue, tables made from reclaimed barnwood, walls adorned with album covers and local artist work. The centerpiece was a sound system, a state-of-the-art setup that could fill the space with perfect audio, coupled with a vintage turntable displayed behind glass like a museum piece. Every evening, we'd play classic albums in their entirety. No shuffling, no skipping tracks, just the music as the artist intended it to be heard. When Vinyl and Coffee finally opened in the summer of 2003, the line stretched around the block. Former regulars from Joe's Diner, which had sadly closed the previous year, mixed with college students, local musicians, and curious townspeople. The menu was simple but perfect, burgers and shakes reminiscent of the 50s and 60s, alongside specialty coffee drinks named after classic rock songs. That first night, as Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody played over the speakers and the place hummed with conversation and laughter, I caught a glimpse of Sophia watching me from across the room. She raised her coffee mug in a silent toast, her eyes saying what words couldn't. We'd made it. Against all odds, we created something beautiful from the wreckage of our early lives. Running a cafe kept me busy, but I loved every minute. Each day brought new faces, new conversations about music and memories. Regular customers began requesting their favorite albums for evening play. Thursday night vinyl swaps became a town tradition, with collectors bringing treasures to trade while sipping on Strawberry Fields Fraps or Hotel California cold brews. Local musicians started asking if they could perform acoustic sets on weekend afternoons. Art students from Sophia's school exhibited their work on our walls, often making their first sales to cafe patrons. Without really planning it, We created the kind of cultural hub that small towns rarely get to enjoy, a place where creativity and community intersected over good food and great music. Life was better than I'd ever imagined it could be. Sophia and I got married in a simple ceremony on the cafe's patio, with Wonderful Tonight by Eric Clapton playing as she walked toward me in a vintage-inspired dress she designed herself. Our honeymoon was 2 weeks exploring the great music cities of America: Nashville, Memphis, New Orleans, Chicago, Seattle, a vinyl pilgrimage that filled our luggage with rare treasures for the cafe's collection. We'd been back for just a week when they showed up. I was behind the counter, showing a new barista how to properly pull an espresso shot. When I glanced up and saw them standing awkwardly by the door, my parents, looking older and somehow smaller than I remembered. Mom's hair had more gray, and Dad's shoulders slumped in a way they never had before. They hadn't contacted me since Ruth's death and the reading of her will. I'd sent them a wedding invitation, out of some sense of obligation, but they hadn't responded. Now here they were, taking in the cafe, my success, with expressions I couldn't quite read. Dad spotted me first. Our eyes met across the room, and for a moment I was 18 again, angry, hurt, betrayed. Then Sophia's hand was on my arm, grounding me, reminding me of who I had become in the years since I'd left their house with my vinyl collection and little else. I nodded to barista to take over and walked slowly toward them. They'd seen the news reports about the Pollock, a feel-good local story about the small-town kid whose grandmother's junk painting turned out to be worth millions. It had made national news briefly, one of those human interest pieces that fill the last few minutes of evening broadcasts. "Nice place you've got here," Dad said, his voice lacking its usual authority. Mom just stared, taking the framed article about me from Rolling Stone magazine. They'd done a piece on the cafe as part of Feature on Vinyl's comeback. She looked like she was seeing a stranger. Dad cleared his throat. "We should talk, Ethan, about the painting, about the money." And there it was, the real reason for their visit. Not to reconnect, not to apologize, not to celebrate my success. They wanted a cut of the windfall that had come from the junk they'd been ready to throw away. "Your family," Dad continued, gaining confidence. "Family shares with family. That painting came from our house, your grandmother's house. Legally, it should have been part of her estate." I felt a cold fury rising in me, but kept my voice level. "You gave it to me, Dad. Said it was worthless. Called it trash and told me to take it if I wanted a keepsake. Remember?" Mom jumped in, her voice placating. "We never imagined it was valuable, Ethan. No one did. But now that it's turned out to be worth so much, surely you see that it's only fair to share with your family." I looked between them. These people who had prioritized my sister over me at every turn, who had stolen my college savings, who had made me feel worthless in my own home, who now wanted to benefit from the one good thing that had come from Ruth's death. "Where's Emily?" I asked. "Shouldn't she be here too if this is about family?" An uncomfortable glance passed between them. Mom's lips thinned. "Emily married Bradley Johnson last year. His father owns that chain of furniture stores. She doesn't speak to us much these days." So Emily had moved on to greener pastures, leaving our parents behind once they were no longer useful to her ambitions. I wish I could say I was surprised. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it, for all their faults. It must have hurt to be discarded by the child they'd sacrificed everything for. "But I'm not giving you money for a painting you were going to throw in the dumpster. The courts would agree with me, but feel free to try your luck with a lawsuit." Dad's face reddened. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low but threatening. They left without ordering anything, Mom glancing back once with an expression I couldn't interpret. Sophia found me later in the office, staring blankly at inventory sheets without really seeing them. "You okay?" she asked, perching on the edge of my desk. "Yeah," I said, surprised to find it was true. "Actually, I am. They can't hurt me anymore." I thought that would be the end of it. Dad might bluster about lawsuits, but any decent lawyer would tell him he had no case. The painting had been abandoned property, given to me freely. Plus, the publicity of suing their own son over his grandmother's legacy would hardly paint them in a flattering light. Life moved on. The cafe thrived. Sophia's first gallery show sold out completely. I started writing a book about the resurgence of vinyl in the digital age, combining my journalism background with my passion for records. We talk about starting a family, about expanding the cafe concept to other towns, about all the possibilities that stretch before us. Then, almost exactly a year after their first visit, they came back. This time, they looked different. Dad had lost weight, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. Mom's face was drawn with worry. They didn't come to the cafe but called my cell phone, asking to meet at their house, the same one I'd left that summer day 5 years earlier. Against Sophia's concerns, I went alone. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the front yard less kempt. Inside, nothing had changed much. Same furniture, same family photos where Emily dominated and I was an afterthought. Dad sat heavily in his recliner, breathing with a slight wheeze I hadn't noticed before. Mom perched on the edge of the sofa, hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I've got heart problems," Dad said without preamble. "Need bypass surgery. Insurance covers some, but not enough. The specialist, the one with the best success rates, he's out of network. $50,000 all told." Mom's eyes welled with tears. "We've tried everything, Ethan. Second mortgage the house. Cashed in the retirement accounts. Asked Emily." Her voice trailed off, and I could fill in the blanks. They weren't asking this time. They were begging. The same people who had dismissed my dreams, taken my savings, and tried to claim my good fortune were now looking at me as their last hope. I should have felt vindicated. Should have enjoyed watching them squirm. Should have reminded them of every time they'd favored Emily, every cutting remark about my phase, every dollar mine they'd spent on her future while dismissing mine. Instead, Ruth's voice echoed in my head. "Being kind when the world is cruel isn't weakness, Ethan. It's the hardest strength there is." I took out my checkbook. Yes, I still carried one for occasions when old school was required, and wrote a check for $50,000. No strings, no repayment plan, no gloating. Dad stared at the check in disbelief. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, something I'd never seen before, not even at Ruth's funeral. "I don't understand," he said, voice rough. "After everything, I'm not doing for you." I said truthfully, "I'm doing for Ruth and for myself, because I don't want to be the kind of person who turns away from family in need, even when that family turned away from me." Mom was openly crying now. Dad looked down at the check again, then back at me. "I was wrong," he said, the word seeming physically painful for him to utter. "About you, about everything. I was so focused on Emily's potential that I couldn't see yours. By the time I realized my mistake, it seemed too late. It wasn't full apology, but for my father it was seismic, an admission of fault that would have been unthinkable in the old days. Have the surgery," I said, standing to leave. "That's all I ask." I didn't expect things to change drastically after that, and they didn't, not immediately. But small shifts began to occur. Dad had the surgery and recovered well. They started coming to cafe occasionally, sitting quietly at a corner table, observing this world I created. Mom would bring small homemade treats for the staff. Dad would nod along to the music, sometimes mentioning that he remembered when a particular song first came out. They never fully apologized for the past. Some wounds are too deep, some patterns too ingrained to completely overcome. But we found a way to coexist, to build something new from the ashes of our old relationship. Not close, not the Norman Rockwell version of family, but something real and honest. Emily never came around. Last I heard, she had divorced Bradley Johnson and moved to Los Angeles to try breaking into fashion design. She sent my parents vaguely worded postcards on major holidays. Some patterns repeat across generations, I guess. As for Sophia and I, we welcomed twins, a boy and a girl, 2 years after that second meeting with my parents. We named the boy Joseph, after old Joe from the diner, who gave me my first job. The girl we named Ruth, for obvious reasons. The cafe expanded to 3 locations across the state. I finished my book on vinyl culture, and it did well enough that Rolling Stone hired me as a regular contributor. Sophia's artwork began appearing in major galleries. Her unique style, blending music and visual art, earning critical acclaim beyond what either of us had imagined possible. We're comfortable now, but not extravagant. Most of the Pollock money remains invested, growing steadily to secure our children's futures while still leaving them hungry enough to find their own paths. We live well but simply. In the same house we bought after the auction, though Sophia's studio has expanded twice to accommodate her larger installations. Sometimes on summer evenings when the air is warm and still, I sit on our porch with a glass of lemonade, a vinyl record spinning nearby, and think about the strange, winding path that brought me here, about Ruth and her quiet wisdom, about the painting that hung unrecognized for decades before changing our lives, about second chances and unexpected redemptions. A while back, a teenager came into the original cafe location, looked around at the vinyl collection and record players with bewilderment, and loudly asked his friend, "Why would anyone listen to music this way when you can just stream on your phone?" Before I could answer, a regular customer, a grizzled guy in his 60s who comes in every Tuesday for our meatloaf special, looked up from his coffee. "Tell that to Freddie Mercury," he said. "Some music deserves better than being compressed to nothing and pumped through earbuds." The kid looked confused, but took a seat anyway. By the time he left, he'd purchased a used record player and a dog-eared copy of A Night at the Opera. That's the thing about vinyl, about music that matters. It finds a way to survive, to speak to new generations who didn't know they were missing its voice. The same could be said for resilience, for the human capacity to endure hardship and emerge stronger on the other side. Ruth used to say, "Live, so your music plays loud enough for others to hear it." I think about that often now that I'm a father, now that I'm building something meant to last beyond my own lifetime. I want my children to know their own worth, to play their own songs without apology, to recognize beauty in unexpected places. Sometimes the most valuable treasures are hiding in plain sight, behind a dresser, inside a dusty album sleeve within ourselves. The trick is having the courage to look for them, the wisdom to recognize them, and the faith to believe they were there all along, waiting to be discovered. Life isn't perfect. My relationship with my parents remains complicated. There are days when a cafe feels like too much responsibility, when Sophia and I argue about mundane things like who forgot to buy milk or whether Joseph needs a haircut. Times when I miss Ruth so fiercely it's like losing her all over again. But most days, I'm overwhelmingly grateful for this unlikely second act, for the chance to build something authentic from the wreckage of those early disappointments. For Sophia, who saw me clearly from that first rainy night. For our children, who will never know what it's like to have their dreams dismissed as phases or their passions called worthless. And for Ruth, whose final gift wasn't really the painting at all, but the value she instilled in me. Perseverance, authenticity, the courage to forge my own path, and yes, the strength found in choosing kindness even when it's a harder option. That's the thing about vinyl records. They're imperfect. They pop and crackle. They get scratched. They require care and attention. But the music they produce has a warmth, a presence, a humanity that more technically perfect formats sometimes lack. People like that too, I think. Imperfect, scratched by life, sometimes playing off-key, but capable of creating something beautiful and authentic if given the chance, if heard all the way through instead of being judged by a single track. When visitors ask about the story behind vinyl and coffee, I usually give them the condensed version, the quirky tale of a grandmother's painting that turned out to be a priceless masterpiece. It makes for good press, good branding. But the real story, the one I'm telling you now, is about more than a lucky break or a rags to riches twist of fate. It's about finding your rhythm in a world that wants to drown it out, about playing your own song, even when no one else seems to be listening, about recognizing that sometimes life's most important tracks are hidden on the B-side. And it's about understanding that while you can't choose the family you're born into, you can choose the family you create. The people who hear your music clearly, who dance to your particular rhythm, who help amplify your voice when it's in danger of being lost in the noise. In the end, that's what Ruth taught me. That's what Sophia reminds me. And that's what I hope to pass on to Joseph and little Ruth. That each of us has a unique song to sing, a melody that's ours alone. And that living well means playing it loud enough for the world to hear without apology, without compromise. In this small corner of Pennsylvania, with vintage vinyl spinning and coffee brewing, surrounded by the family I found and the community we built, I'd like to think we're doing exactly that.